guys hear me without the microphone, or should I be close? Right here, I'll try to stay still. And I need this. All right, well, thank you all for coming to hear a little bit about Atlantic sturgeon. And being a species that grows over 14 feet long, it's not a surprise that humans have been harvesting them for hundreds and hundreds of years, from Native Americans throughout European settlement. There's actually some evidence that Atlantic sturgeon substantially helped the colonists at Jamestown, with tens of thousands of scutes being unearthed at Fort James. It wasn't until the late 1800s that more quantitative estimates began to emerge. These are coastwide landings of Atlantic sturgeon. So back in the late 1800s, you can see that harvest was extremely high, with over 3 million kilograms harvested within a single year. That harvest remained high for several years, but then we see it drop off substantially, indicating that something might be going on with this fishery. We continued to harvest them throughout the remainder of the century, but at much, much lower levels than had been previously observed. Same graph, but for New York, and we have a very similar pattern to what we were observing along the coast, with that peaking harvest at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, and then this dramatic drop-off. At this time, Atlantic sturgeon were commonly referred to as Albany beef, first of all because they were really common, but they also apparently tasted like beef, especially when cut and grilled as steaks. And to give you just a little bit of a perspective of what things were like during this time period, here's a news article from 1875 saying the Fredenberg brothers caught so many in one cast of the net that their two boats couldn't hold them, and they had to throw some of their Albany beef out to pasture again. However, we start to see a very different story just 25 years later, when we still have relatively high harvests. Now sturgeon are not so abundant in the market as they formerly were, and there are probably many of our younger citizens who have never tasted sturgeon or have heard it called Albany beef. So despite this early foreshadowing, in the early 1900s, we continued to harvest them throughout the remainder of the century, and actually start to increase towards the end of it. So looking more at these recent years, we're seeing landings decline along the coast, denoted in those black bars. However, in New York and New Jersey, we're actually seeing an increase in harvest, peaking around 1990, and then to drop off again. So up until 1993, the fishery was operating relatively widely open. It's a strange way to say it, but nonetheless. With a minimum size limit of 48 inches, but outside of that, daily take was unlimited, and the season operated year-round. However, as we're seeing this decline in landings, we're realizing that we probably need to change our management actions. So in 1994 and 1995, the minimum size limit was increased to 60 inches. Take was dramatically reduced to just a single individual, and the season was truncated to just a single month between May and June. Ultimately, that was not enough, and the fishery was closed in 1996. So this was happening not just in New York, but through all the Atlantic coastal states. And it ultimately led to a stock assessment in 1998 that essentially said that all of the stocks up and down the coast are severely depressed, and suggested that there would be a moratorium on harvest throughout the entire coast. That moratorium was enacted the same year, and a few years later, a status review team determined that the species as a whole could be broken into 5 distinct population segments: the South Atlantic, Carolina, Chesapeake, New York Bight, and Gulf of Maine. And a few years after that, lower 4 DPSs were listed as endangered under the ESA, with the northernmost being listed as threatened. So now what? The fishery's closed, the species is endangered. What are we going to do? Well, while the fisheries were still operating, it became pretty apparent that we needed to assess the status of these depleted stocks. And then with this moratorium going into place to try to see what kind of influence this has on the fishery as a whole. And so long-term monitoring could hopefully answer both of those questions. However, we're dealing with a highly migratory species that's only in the river for a short period of time, coupled with spawning periodicity. So males might spawn every year, maybe every 2 years, females 3 to 5 years. And so trying to monitor only a small portion of the population when they're in the river within a given year makes monitoring difficult at best. That, coupled even more with protracted spawning throughout the season and spawning in multiple locations, makes the effort more difficult in terms of staffing and logistics to get out and monitor, again, just a portion of this population. Plus, these fish are big, and it looks like that's a lot of work, and Russ and Amanda can attest to that giant fish they're trying to get in the boat. So why not monitor them when they're much smaller and definitely not as heavy? And this is could be really helpful for a couple of reasons. First of all, monitoring them at this life stage is indicating that we're having successful reproduction and recruitment, as well as at this life stage, individuals remain in the river anywhere from 2 to 6 years. So we're going to get a better picture of the population as a whole to monitor them when they're much smaller and remaining in the river, as opposed to the adults that are in here for just a short period of time. And so that's exactly what we set out to do. So the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, coupled with Cornell University, first tried to find where and when these young fish occur. And from there to refine the sampling and methodology to best sample this portion of the population. So from this work, we learned that fish are in higher abundances in the lower sections of the river. And although more variable, gill nets collect a higher number of fish relative to trawling. And so ultimate recommendations from this study were to sample Newburgh Bay with a gill net survey. And a few things arose with this study. The first being that sampling primarily occurred during summer months. And so this is when fish are much more mobile, foraging throughout a larger portion of the river, as well as not sampling these overwintering locations. That kind of leads back to that first point. If we're able to sample the population when they're presumably in just a few discrete locations within the river and in higher concentrations, we would hopefully be able to get better abundance estimates. And so building off of this study, again, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, coupled this time with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, attempted to sample these overwintering locations and to also look to see if habitat type influence the catch rates that we were observing. So the two primary overwintering locations within the Hudson are Newburgh and Haverstraw Bay. Between these two locations, we found that we were catching fish in greater abundance and more consistently in Haverstraw Bay, and particularly in the spring. So before these fish leave their overwintering locations, relative to sampling in the fall when fish are first starting to come here to overwinter. Habitat type also influenced catch, where we were catching higher numbers and more consistently in soft deep habitats. So this is areas within the bay that are greater than 20 feet of water and over sands and silt, or mud and silt. So following recommendations from this study, we've been consistently sampling the juvenile population over the last 15 years. So gill nets in Haverstraw Bay during the springtime in these soft deep areas. And at this point I want to pause and say thank you to all of the hardworking people within the unit, within the agency that made this long-term monitoring possible. There was a lot of years that went into, first of all, developing a long-term monitoring program, and then to take that and be doing it consistently for 15 years. So what do the trends look like? And I'm happy to report they're positive. So since the start of the survey, we have been seeing an increase in our annual mean catch. There are a few years in the early 2000s where we see lower catch rates as well as a few more in recent years. But in general, the trend is positive. So this is looking good. How does this relate to the fishery closure, specifically in 1996 within the Hudson River? Well, it takes females anywhere from 15 to 20 years to mature. And so it wouldn't be until 2011 that we should be seeing offspring from those first protected year classes in 1996. And so we don't see a crazy population boom in the year 2000, which would be expected if we have this spawning periodicity of 3 to 5 years. However, if you look at the average catch rates for years prior to when we would be seeing protected year classes and years after, we do see higher catch rates during these post-moratorium years. And so now I kind of want to focus on the variability. You can see there's a lot of inter and intra-annual variability that we're observing with the survey. And so the next question we wanted to ask is how environmental variables might be influencing the catch rates within this survey. So we use generative additive modeling to look at these environmental variables, and the ones that popped out to be the most important were tide stage, salinity, and temperature. So looking a little bit closely at each one of these variables, first looking at tide and presence absence, so whether or not we catch at least one fish in our net versus no fish. And across the tide stage, from flood through slack to ebb, we don't really see a big pattern in terms of presence absence. If we look at our mean catch rate, though, we have higher catch during a flood tide relative to slack and ebb. And the mechanism behind this is a little difficult to discern, but it could be potentially how the net is fishing in the water. So a flood tide, the currents associated with a flood tide are weaker than that of an ebb, and so our net might be fishing more upright in the water column as opposed to being pushed by the current. However, the same could be said about slack tide, where we have little to no current, albeit that slack tides are much shorter in duration relative to a running tide. Another potential reason behind this could be the amount of salt that's being pushed in with a flood tide. So looking at salinity now, and that's just a shotgun blast of points with not really much of a discernible pattern, but there is a small bump that we're seeing around 1 part per thousand. So looking at that with our mean catch rates and presence absence, we can see that when we're sampling in freshwater, it's about a 50-50 chance on whether or not we collect a sturgeon in our net, and our mean catch rate is much lower. However, as we get closer to 1 part per thousand before kind of leveling off, we are seeing this increase in our catch and in our presence absence. And so this gradual increase to 1 part per thousand corresponds to the salt front moving into our sampling location here in Haverstraw Bay. Within the Hudson and other coastal rivers, this freshwater saltwater interface has been documented to be really important for these young juvenile fish. Growth is optimized at these low to moderate salinity levels, as well as preferred food sources are found in this freshwater saltwater interface. Lastly, another shotgun blast here with catch and temperature, but we're seeing a little bit more of a trend here with catch increasing with increasing water temperatures. Same story for our mean catch as well as our presence absence. And the mechanism behind this is likely just a simple function of as the water warms up, fish are becoming more and more mobile, begin to feed and start moving out of our overwintering location here. And gill nets being a passive gear, when we have fish becoming more active, that's likely just going to increase our chances of encountering them in our gear. And so lastly, to talk about the inter and intra-annual variability that we observe for these variables. And you can see that there's some years that we're sampling in almost entirely fresh water, versus some years that are much colder or much warmer than others. And so how do these variables relate to the overall time series. So we're seeing variability with our environmental factors, and we're still seeing variability with our catch data. So again, by using generative additive modeling, we can look at what predicted catch would be if we hold those environmental variables constant. So holding them constant at their mean, looking at what our predicted catch rate would look like. And it's almost a mirror image of our actual annual mean catch rates. And this is actually a good thing. Once we take out environmental variation, the trends that we're observing with this survey should be reflective of what is actually going on within the system. And this is really important when it comes to management. There was another benchmark stock assessment conducted just a couple of years ago in which our data were used. And the overall summary from that report, first with the New York bite, is that although our abundance is still lower than what it was relative to historic levels, things are looking better since the moratorium in 1998. For the coast, again, things are depleted since are relative to historic levels. But looking at the moratorium, abundance and biomass has increased. And so to also point out this far right column, there's a lot of uncertainty to these estimates, and there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of trying to figure out what's going on with this population as a whole. But having surveys like ours, it's really important to feed into this interstate management action, as our survey is one of the few surveys up and down the coast that actually targets juvenile fish. So having data like this is really important for years to come to set these recovery targets for this species. And that's it. Thank you.